sharing of wealth as well. How do you explain social differences? So, one of the ways we've already talked about is the Purusha Sukta hymn in the Rig Veda, where social differences are explained in divine terms that God has ordained it this way, therefore, it cannot be changed. The Buddhist explanation is slightly different. So, in the Sutta Pitaka, there is a myth which says that originally human beings did not have fully evolved bodies, nor was the world of plants fully developed. Everyone lived in, a state of cooperation and peace, and they took from nature only what they needed. So, as time moved on, there was a gradual deterioration, and humans became increasingly greedy, vindictive, and deceitful. And this began to lead to some chaos. So, this led them to wonder that what if we selected someone from among us, who would maintain, order, who would punish the wrongdoers and banish the wrongdoers. And what we will do is, for his services, we will give them a portion of the rice or whatever form of wealth we have. But this person would be elected by the whole people, chosen by the whole people, and be known as the Mahasammata. Now, what interesting stuff emerges out of it? One, it's a social contract that so long as the king or the leader of the community looks after the needs of the community, people are going to give him a tax. Yes, so they're going to give him a share of their wealth, right? They're also talking about human agency, that it's the human beings who decided that we will have such a system where there will be someone over us who will, keep us organized. Um, and we are going to elect this leader, right? And because human agency is involved, humans can change it as time changes, as the requirements of the different ages differ. Yes, so this is a huge departure from the Purusha Sukta hymn of the Rig Veda. So you may get a question on, how are social differences explained by Brahmanical explanations versus the Buddhist argument. So you can be asked such a question like this. So you can use points from this presentation. Now let's come back to Mahabharata as a text. So when the historian looks at the Mahabharata as a text, what are the things that a historian must keep in mind when we use this as a source of historical information? First of all, let's look at the language and content. So what's the language? Of course, it is Sanskrit. At least the original Mahabharata is supposed to have been written in Sanskrit. But when we compare the Sanskrit of the Mahabharata with the Sanskrit of the Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras, which were largely being composed at the same time, we see that the Mahabharata Sanskrit is very simple. It's as simple so that if it is recited out loud, women in Shudra who were not to study the Vedas, who were not supposed to get formal education, they would understand this Sanskrit. Right? Now, when we look at the authors, who were the authors? Now, the authors were, perhaps to begin with, the charioteer bards or the sutas. When we think about Sanjaya, who was supposed to have divine vision and who was recounting the war as it happened to Dhritarashtra, who was blind and couldn't see, this sort of gives us a hint that perhaps it was these charioteer bards. Now, how charioteer bards? Now, these were the charioteers of these great warriors. They actually had a first hand knowledge of the battles, of the deeds of heroism that these heroes were performing. So they would closely observe the battle and compose and recite poems and songs in praise of them. Yeah. Later on, of course, we see that by the 5th century BCE, the Brahmins begin to take over the story. Right. Now, what is the intended audience? Now, obviously, when we look at the simple Sanskrit, it is perhaps the ordinary people who do not have access to the Vedas and to the law books of the Brahmins, which are of much tougher Sanskrit. Yes, so to tell them through a story format that this is how people should behave. So through the story of Eklavya, being told that you should not transgress your caste norms, otherwise you'll be punished. When we look at the treatment meted out to Draupadi, it's a hint to women that do not question patriarchal norms, otherwise you are going to be humiliated. Yes. Then we see some narrative and didactic elements both in the Mahabharata. Now, what is a narrative element? This is, of course, how the story moves ahead, right? How Draupadi's hand was won in marriage, how she came to have 5 husbands. And then there is the didactic part. Didactic part is actual norms and teachings. Yes, that for example, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita part of the Mahabharata, it's largely didactic. It is part of the story, but it's also didactic, that this is what you should do. This is true knowledge and this is what you should not do, right? But often we see that this narrative and didactic forms are not watertight. Often the didactic part also becomes part of the narrative. Yeah. So, for example, if you look at the incident where the yaksha of the lake actually kills off the four brothers, the four pandavas, except for Yudhishthir, because Yudhishthir correctly answers his questions. So this is part of the narrative, but there are some very existential questions that the yaksha asks Yudhishthir, which he is able to correctly answer, right? Now, Mahabharata has also been called Itihas. Now, Itihas very literally means thus it was. So, does the story of the Mahabharata actually, recount or keep the memory of a real war? Now, this is a little difficult for us to determine. Yes, like so around the 5th century BCE, we have the Kurus and the Panchalas emerging as new kingdoms. Now, we have these new heroes in the story. So perhaps these stories were doing the rounds, but new characters were perhaps added, into the story by the Brahmins, right? And around the 6th century BCE, we have the beginnings of Vaishnavism. And Krishna, at this point, also emerges as a very, very important player in the Mahabharata, right? And especially we have, this whole Bhagavad Gita, which becomes part of the larger Mahabharata text as well. So you see how the Mahabharata has been evolving over a period of time. um, Now there has been a lot of efforts made by archaeologists to find points of convergence between text and between archaeology, between material remains, right? So in the year 1951-52, archaeologist Bibi Lal excavated a village named Hastinapura in Meerut in UP. So was it the same place as the capital of the Kurus, Hastinapur? Again, it's a little difficult to really pinpoint that. Now, what he observes is that there are five occupational levels, of which the second and the third are of dated around the period of the Mahabharata, right? So this in the second phase, that is the 12th to the 7th centuries BCE, he finds walls of mud and mud brick. And the discovery of mud plaster with prominent reed marks suggests that some of the house had reed walls plastered over with mud. But when you read the Mahabharata, they're talking about these opulent palaces, especially when the Indraprastha palace comes up, when the Maya Danav creates this, magical, illusionary palace, yeah, where certain parts of the floor look as if there is water flowing. There are others which doesn't look like water flowing, but actually there is water. Yeah. So how does that match up? How do the material culture which is mentioned in the text match up to what we have available from archaeology? When we look at the third phase, around the 6th to the 3rd centuries BCE, Bibilal notes that the houses of this period were still built of mud brick, but now burnt bricks have been added as well. He finds soakage jars and brick drains which were used for draining out refuse water. He also discovers terracotta ring wells, which may have been used both as wells and as drainage pits, depending on their location. It's a little difficult for archaeologists to tell today whether this was a soakage pit or it was a well to draw out drinking water from. So again, even in the 6th to the 3rd century BCE, the kind of material culture that he finds in this place called Hastinapura doesn't quite match up to the text. So were the authors kind of taking a lot of creative license in talking about this opulence? So these are questions that we need to encounter as we deal with the text. We now come to a very key element in the Mahabharata, which is Draupadi's marriage. Uh, this is again part of convergence. So um, there's the practice of polyandry. Now, largely polyandry is seen against Brahmanical social code that one woman cannot have multiple husbands in the same lifetime. But well, Draupadi has five husbands. Now, what do you do with it? So the Brahmins tried to create stories to justify. So they made stories like how in a previous birth, Draupadi asked for a husband five times. So well, she got five husbands in this birth. In others, there are stories about how Draupadi asked for so many qualities in her husband that five men would be needed to have those qualities. Yet other stories talk about how the five Pandavas are actually incarnations of Indra, and therefore Draupadi is actually Indrani, which is why she needs to be married to all five brothers when they're born as mortals. So historians argue that perhaps, Draupadi was a Himalayan princess, where till very recently we did have, polyandrous marriages existing. largely due to economic reasons, where agrarian land was very difficult to come by, and the families did not want division of the agrarian land. So, which is why they would marry all the brothers of the family to one girl. Others have suggested that there may have been shortage of women during times of warfare, uh, or perhaps shortage of women during warfare because of the enemy sort of overrunning the defeated kingdom and perhaps killing off all the women or taking them away as slaves. So perhaps polyandry was a way to restore the population of the area. So in other words, both of these situations talk about a situation of crisis. So perhaps right, so the justification there that you can't really do away with Draupadi being wife to five husbands at the same time. Now, why is Mahabharata considered to be a dynamic text? One, it continues to evolve. That is, new layers are being discussed in retellings from different perspectives. So when you look at modern day authors, so many of them are talking about the story from different perspectives. So you have Palace of Illusions by Chitra Divakaruni, which talks about the story from Draupadi's perspective. Then we have stories of the Mahabharata being retold from Bhim's perspective or from Duryodhan's perspective. Yes. So layer upon layer is being uncovered by present day authors. Then Mahabharata continues to be a very favorite theme in visual arts and sculptures and paintings right through the ages. Performing arts as well, where dance, music, and theater also kind of, look at a new angle to the story to present it. So Mahabharata, in a certain sense, even though it's such an old text, yeah, it is about at least 2,000 years old, 3,000 years old. Yet it Mahabharata remains so relevant. It does talk about human failings. It does talk about greed. It talks about jealousy. It talks about covetousness of other people's property. Fights between brothers over inheritance and so on. So the story remains extremely current, which is why um, Mahabharata is seen as a dynamic text. This is also a question that comes quite often. So you can use these various points to argue out why Mahabharata is a dynamic text. We come to some concluding points now. Another chapter closes with a very interesting story written by Mahashweta Devi. She takes up the story when the war is over, and Kunti, along with Dhritarashtra and Gandhari and Vidur, kind of retire to the forest, and Yudhishthir has now become king. And Kunti every day is sort of recounting her life experiences. And if she perceives that she has committed an error, she asks for forgiveness. And she notices that there is a woman who keeps watching her from a distance. And then ultimately, there is a forest fire, and the woman approaches Kunti and identifies herself. And she says that she is the daughter in law of, the Nishada woman who had been burnt down in the Rakshagriha along with her five sons. And she says that you have apologized for everything, but never once have you talked about the sacrifice of my mother-in-law and my husband's, where you burnt them down. They were not at fault at all. I mean, what had they done to you that they had to burn? They had to die such a horrific death of being burnt alive. And Kunti, of course, is completely taken aback, and uh, I suppose she feels some regret, which is why she doesn't run away from the forest fire and lets the fire consume her. So this is a question being raised from the marginalized folk. So Mahashweta Devi, we know, has was this uh, uh, spokesperson for the Dalits and the marginalized people of society, and many of her works actually represent and reflect that ideology. So she does talk about. So this is also a kind of retelling of the Mahabharata, right? This episode has no reference in the Ved Vyas's Mahabharata, but just like Mahashweta Devi, there are other modern day authors who are looking at different retellings, looking at the story from different angles and perspectives, and trying to give a voice to those characters who do not have any voice in the main story. So I hope this session also has been useful to you. If you like the session, please don't forget to give a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more such chapters that I'm going to be discussing with you to help you with your preparation for the board examination. All the best.